So this summer we've been going through the Ten Commandments, and today we have reached number 6, perhaps the most infamous, the one that really should seem to be pretty straightforward, and yet perhaps also the one that is the most hotly debated. Thou shalt not murder. It seems like it should be a simple thing. It's just 4 words in English, and in Hebrew, fun fact, it's literally just one word with how their grammar works. And yet, obviously, it's not a simple thing, since throughout human history, there has always been violence and murder and war. I do think it's important to mention that rates of violent crime in America have gone down almost by half just during my lifetime. It doesn't feel that way, but that's because styles of news and communication have changed. It's one thing to read an article about a murder in your morning newspaper for people who remember morning newspapers. It's another thing to read that news in the morning and then have it at your fingertips all the rest of the day with added commentary from every form of social media. And then the news itself is about both the murder and the response to the murder, and there's a hashtag, and then give it a decade or two, and there will be podcasts digging deep into the circumstances, and maybe even a TV movie. It feels like rates of violent crime have exploded within the last decade, but they objectively haven't, and I can cite my sources. This isn't going to be a particularly cheerful sermon, but I did want to preach the good news of those statistics because violence isn't hopelessly inevitable. It is possible for people and societies to change for the better. I really wanted to include those statistics, but there wasn't a particularly great place to put them, so I made it an aside at the beginning. Elegant transition from modern crime rates back to scripture. So I don't want to be up here floating on a golden cloud of holier than thou, but I personally have never murdered anyone. But to be fair, maybe in another life that might not have been such an easy brag. What if I were living in the midst of a global famine? Or if I'd been a member of a resistance group against an oppressive government? Or if I lived in a society in which basically everyone believed that some minority group was inherently less worthy of life than other people? Or what if I had found myself in some kind of situation in which it was either someone else's life or mine? Thou shalt not murder can get messy. How do you define murder, or for that matter, life? There are a few clarifications in the Bible, perhaps not as many as we might want. In the book of Numbers, we read that fatal accidents are not considered murder. Murder is what happens when one person kills another with hatred and anger. There are many rules in the Bible for how to carry out a just war, another very loaded and complex term that I spent an entire semester studying and still don't feel qualified to comment on. Many, perhaps most people, would categorize war and murder as very different things, but we are still called to avoid violence if we can. Among the rules for war in the book of Deuteronomy is an instruction that one should always offer peace before any fighting begins. Much earlier in the book of Genesis, we are told that there must be some kind of justice when someone sheds the blood of another human. For in God's own image, God made humankind. If we are made in the image of God, then to kill another person is to kill a reflection of God. But is it enough for us all to just, not go out and stab people? Of course, there's more to it than that. It's one thing for us to simply, not murder people, but it's another thing entirely to actively work towards a more peaceful society that promotes respectful dialogue and finds ways to prevent circumstances that might lead to violence. Is it enough that we ourselves have never committed murder? As the Heidelberg Catechism of 1563 put it, no. By condemning envy, hatred, and anger, God wants us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to be patient, peace-loving, gentle, merciful, and friendly towards them, to protect them from harm as much as we can, and to do good even to our enemies. Thou shalt not commit murder. But what are we doing to save lives? Our second scripture reading this morning comes to us from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Abraham heard God say to him, "Abraham." And Abraham said, "Here I am." The voice said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you live in awe of God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. I should probably have prefaced that with the warning that the story of Abraham and Isaac on the mountaintop is concerning, to say the least. I don't expect it to be anyone's favorite piece of scripture, but it is nevertheless an important piece of scripture. It's read every year at one of the 2 most important Jewish holy days. It's a central story in Islam. In our tradition, it's one of the readings for the Easter Vigil, and on top of that, it comes up every 3 years in the lectionary of Sunday scripture readings that many churches follow around the world. Isaac is the only son of Abraham and Sarah, a faithful couple who were miraculously able to have a child in their 90s. They named him Isaac, which means laughter. The story never misses a chance to tell us who Isaac is: Abraham's son, Abraham's only son, the son whom Abraham loves. And that son, that only legitimate son, that beloved son, is the son and heir whom Abraham takes up a mountain, binds up on an altar, and is ready to kill. Maybe Abraham heard a voice that he thought was the voice of God, and maybe that voice fed his ego, a desire to prove himself and show off his faith in a way that would impress his contemporaries who practiced human sacrifice and didn't understand Abraham's faith. Maybe in his old age he got confused and mixed up the stories of other gods with the stories of our God. Maybe he really thought that it was God asking him to do this terrible thing. But here's the thing. Our God is a God of love, and any voice that does not call us to ways of love and of justice and of kindness is not the voice of God. The voice that tells us to be selfish is not the voice of God. The voice that tells us to hurt others, or tells us that we are better than anyone else, or tells us to sit back and relax and let someone else fight for justice, or tells us to hurt other people, that's not the voice of God. If you are not sure whether the voice calling you is the voice of God, if you're not sure whether a message or a doctrine or a policy is something that God would speak for, ask yourself if that voice is calling you to live into God's love for the world. I don't think that it was really God who told Abraham to sacrifice his son. I do think that Abraham did genuinely believe that it was God. But I also don't think that my reading makes the story any easier to hear. There is no supernatural force, no divine being, no cosmic destiny that forces people to do violence. We can't absolve ourselves of responsibility that easy. There's no one to blame but humanity when we choose to listen to voices that make us hurt each other. God does not command us to kill each other. That's all on us. And yet, the story of Abraham and Isaac on the mountain is not a tragedy. It's certainly not a comedy, and it's not exactly a pleasant story, but it is not a tragedy. It has the best and happiest ending that it possibly can. Abraham takes his son Isaac up a mountain. Isaac, his son, his only legitimate son, the son whom he loves, the son whom he is prepared to kill. But no one dies in this story. Again, the story isn't happy or comforting or the sort of story that one might read to a child before bed from a picture book Bible. But this story is not a tragedy. The tragedy comes later, when the story repeats itself. In the book of Judges, there is a man named Jephthah who comes home from a military victory. High on adrenaline, he swears to God that he will offer up a sacrifice of whoever comes out of the door of his house as he approaches. But the first to come out of his home is his daughter, his only child, running out to greet him with tambourines. And if you know the story of Abraham and Isaac, and you hear the story of Jephthah and his nameless daughter, you might be hoping that at this point another angel of God will come at the last moment and say, Jephthah, stop. Do not lay your hand on the girl or do anything to her. But there is no angel in that story. No one stops him. Jephthah does not change his mind. He does not admit that he spoke carelessly. He does not choose to follow the sixth commandment. Where was the voice that could have saved Jephthah's daughter? That is the tragedy of the story. Not that Abraham almost killed his child, but that other fathers did choose to go through with it. Thousands of years later, before he himself was killed in the First World War, the poet Wilfred Owen wrote about the story of Abraham and Isaac and the terrible thing that almost happened on the mountain in these lines from the parable of the old man and the young. Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called out from heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son. And half the seed of Europe, one by a one. Where was the voice that could have saved so many millions of lives, soldier and civilian, in that First World War or any other? Where is the voice that will stop the countless acts of violence that happen every day? The commandments tell us not to murder. But if we want to really live into that commandment, if we want to build a more peaceful world, there needs to be a voice that will call out and stop the violence and offer a better way. We are called to be that voice. You and me and all of us. To really live into that commandment, we must be the voice that will call out and stop the violence and offer a better way. That is how we share the word of the Lord.